Okay, so picture that you're driving down this super desolate Alaskan highway, like
Yeah.
windows down, pine trees everywhere. You haven't seen another car in like hours.
Wow.
Days could go by without seeing another person. And then you see him, this young guy, barely out of his teens, hitchhiking along that very road. He's determined to just live off the land, escape all the craziness of civilization, and find himself out in the wild.
Yeah.
This is the story of Chris McCandless.
A story that's both captivating and controversial. It really makes you think about, like, our own desire for freedom, and that fascination we all have with the wilderness. And where's that line between, being brave and being reckless?
Yeah, for sure. So today we're doing a deep dive into the life and the tragic death of Chris McCandless. We're
Absolutely.
going to be looking at the facts, the myths, the questions that just keep lingering. And we've got a lot of great sources to help us do that. We've got Into the Wild by John Krakauer, of course.
Of course.
But we also have The Wild Truth by Chris's sister, Corinne McCandless. And that book really shows us a whole different side to the story.
Right. And that's what I find so interesting about Chris's story is how much our understanding of him has changed over time, especially after his sister's book came out, years later.
Exactly. Like for the longest time, the main story we knew was from Krakauer's book, Into the Wild, right?
Right.
And it kind of painted Chris as this young idealist, a rebel who wanted to live like Thoreau out in the Alaskan wilderness.
Hmm.
But then Corinne's book, The Wild Truth, comes along and sheds light on this darker, more complex backstory,
Yeah.
a family history full of abuse and this deep need to escape.
Right. It makes you understand the impact of Chris's childhood on the choices he made. I mean, the abuse that he and Corrine went through because of their father, that really shaped how he saw the world and his deep need to just break free from all that pain and dysfunction in his family.
It's so sad to read Chris's own words in a letter he wrote to Corinne. He said, "It's impossible to explain this to anyone who hasn't lived through it. They will never believe you." I mean, that feeling of being alone, of having this secret that's too heavy to share, you can just feel it in his writing.
Yeah, I mean, imagine carrying that kind of trauma around with you all the time and having to hide the truth behind this mask of normalcy. It's no wonder he looked for comfort in nature, found some peace and freedom out there in the vastness of it all.
And that early love he had for nature eventually turned into this full-blown wanderlust,
Yeah.
right? This need to
Yeah.
escape society and just immerse himself in a life without all the possessions and expectations.
Yeah. And we see it in his early adventures, that cross-country road trip he took after high school, the way he changed when he went back to college. I mean, he was a completely different person compared to the clean-cut kid he was before.
Right, like he came back thinner with long hair and a beard.
Right.
Even brought a machete and a rifle to his dorm room.
Oh, wow.
It was like he was shedding his old skin,
Mm.
you know, making a clean break from his family and society's expectations.
Yeah, he really embraced a minimalist lifestyle in college. Excelled in his studies, but you could tell that call of the wild was always there, like an undercurrent pulling at him.
And then bam,
Yeah.
he vanishes. Graduates from Emory University with honors and poof, gone. Donated his entire college fund to Oxfam, cut off all contact with his family, even adopted a new name, Alexander Supertramp. It was like a total rejection of everything he was raised with.
It's a huge turning point in his story. He wasn't just running away from something. He was actively chasing a different way of life. A life he thought he could only find by stripping away all the trappings of modern society and immersing himself in the rawness of nature.
Totally. And his journey took him all over Lake Mead, the Sierra Nevada, the Pacific Crest Trail. He even paddled a canoe down Colorado River to the Gulf of Mexico.
Wow.
He was living on the edge, working odd jobs, embracing this nomadic existence. It's almost like he was pushing himself to the limit, seeing how far he could go, both physically and mentally.
And he was really drawn to writers like Jack London Thoreau, Tolstoy thinkers who championed self-reliance and a simple life in harmony with nature. It's clear he was searching for something deeper, a connection to something bigger than himself. And he believed he could find that in the wilderness, especially in the untamed vastness of Alaska.
Alaska, the last frontier. It was like this huge symbol of freedom for him, a place where he could finally shed all the constraints of civilization and face his true self.
Right, and it's important to understand the power that Alaska holds as a symbol, especially in American culture. It represents this wild, untamed land where you can escape the rules and expectations of society and connect with a more primal, authentic way of being.
And you've experienced the vastness of Alaska firsthand. What are your thoughts on its significance in Chris's story?
Well, Alaska is a place of incredible beauty, but also incredible challenges. You can feel so small standing there in the face of nature's grandeur, and the line between life and death can be so thin.
You told that story about meeting those squatters in that abandoned hotel along the Alaska Highway.
Oh, yeah.
It really showed how unpredictable that region is, how resourceful you have to be, and that sense of isolation that's just everywhere.
Exactly. It's a place that can test you in every way imaginable, physically, mentally, emotionally,
Yeah.
and it can easily swallow you whole if you're not ready for it.
Which brings us to April 1992, when Chris finally reaches Alaska.
Right.
He spends a few days in Fairbanks stocking up on supplies, some rice, a rifle, a field guide to edible plants. But he doesn't take a compass, no map, no snowshoes.
Wow.
He sets off with the bare minimum and the seemingly unshakable belief in his ability to survive.
It's that lack of preparation, that almost willful ignorance of the dangers that makes people see him as reckless and naive. He even meets a guy named Jim Galen who offers to buy him proper gear, but Chris refuses.
He was determined to prove himself, to conquer the wilderness on his own terms.
Yeah.
He heads towards the Stampede Trail, a super remote and difficult area, and finds this abandoned bus that becomes his temporary home.
Right.
And inside the bus, he writes this journal entry that really gives us a glimpse into his state of mind.
Oh, wow. What did he say?
He wrote, 2 years he walks the earth. No phone, no pool, no pets, no cigarettes. Ultimate freedom. An extremist. An aesthetic voyager whose home is the road. Escape from Atlanta. Thou shalt not return, 'cause the West is the best. And now, after 2 rambling years, comes the final and greatest adventure. The climactic battle to kill the false being within and victoriously conclude the spiritual revolution.
Wow, that's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
You can almost hear the influence of Jack London and Thoreau in his words, that romantic vision of himself as a wanderer, a rebel, a seeker of truth.
It's clear he was embracing this idealized version of himself, this persona of Alexander Supertramp, the wilderness warrior, the spiritual revolutionary.
Really?
And that line, killing the false being within, it speaks to such deep inner turmoil, this need to shed the weight of his past, the pain he's carrying, and find his true self through the challenges of the wilderness.
It's such a powerful image, and it resonates with that part of us that longs for that same sense of liberation. A
Yeah.
chance to escape the complexities of life and reconnect with something more primal, more authentic.
So Chris settles into a routine in the bus, hunting small game, foraging for plants, exploring the wilderness. He manages to kill a moose, but trying to preserve all that meat was a total failure.
Oh, wow.
The reality of wilderness survival was setting in, the challenges of living off the land with limited skills and resources.
Right. And even though he was talking about freedom and self-reliance, you start to see hints of loneliness, fear, and doubt creeping into his journal entries.
Oh, really? Like what?
He writes, lonely scared. It's like the mask is starting to slip. That romantic vision is bumping up against the harsh realities of his situation.
And after about 2 months, he decides to leave the bus and head back to civilization.
Okay.
But the Teclanica River is blocking his path. It's swollen with spring snow melt. He's trapped, forced to go back to the bus, stranded, and increasingly desperate.
It's a stark reminder of how unforgiving the Alaskan wilderness can be. One wrong decision, one unexpected change in the environment, and the consequences can be devastating.
He leaves a note on the bus, this desperate plea for help.
What did it say?
It said, SOS, I need your help. I am injured near death and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless.
It's heartbreaking to read those words, knowing what happened to him. You can almost feel the weight of his isolation, the realization that his romanticized idea of self-sufficiency had failed him.
And it's interesting how in this moment of desperation, he goes back to using his real name, Chris McCandless.
Yeah.
It's like he's shedding the persona of Alexander Supertramp, confronting his true self in the face of death.
It makes you wonder, did this journey bring him closer to the self-discovery he was looking for, or did it lead him further astray?
His final journal entries are this mix of beauty and despair.
Yeah.
He writes beautiful blueberries, and I have had a happy life and thank the Lord goodbye, and may God bless all. He also leaves a note with his body that includes that now iconic line, happiness only real when shared.
Those final words have become such a focal point in the debate surrounding Chris McCandless. Some see them as a profound insight, a testament to the importance of human connection. Others view them as a tragic realization, a sign that he ultimately regretted his isolation.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll explore the mystery surrounding Chris's death, the different theories that have come up, and the passionate reactions his story still evokes. But before we move on, what stands out to you so far in his story?
Yeah, what about Chris's journey and his choices resonates with you the most? What about the complexities of his legacy?
We left off with Chris McCandless all alone in that bus, facing the reality that his adventure had taken a dark turn.
Right. It's September 1992. A group of moose hunters are making their way through the thick Alaskan brush. They come across this rusted-out bus, this forgotten spot in the middle of nowhere, and they had no idea they were about to step into a story that would capture the world's attention.
Inside the bus, they find Chris's body. He was so emaciated. It was a stark reminder of the choices he had made, and news of his death spread so quickly. The public was quick to judge.
Yeah, the early story that went around was that this was a reckless young man, unprepared, naive, a victim of his own idealism. Remember, this was before Crean's book came out and revealed the trauma of their childhood. So at the time, people mostly thought he was just a privileged kid who bit off more than he could chew.
Right, and the first theory about how he died seemed to back up that story. People thought he accidentally poisoned himself by eating those wild sweet pea seeds,
Right.
mistaking them for something edible.
Yeah, that image of Chris starving and delirious eating poisonous plants, it really fueled that idea of him being this reckless amateur, someone who went into the wild with this romanticized idea of self-sufficiency but didn't have the basic knowledge to survive.
But John Krakauer, the author who brought Chris's story to the world, he wasn't convinced. He'd spent years researching Chris's journey, interviewed people who met him, even retraced parts of his route. And something about that wild sweet pea theory just didn't sit right with him.
His journalistic instincts were telling him there was more to it than that. He even collected samples of those wild potato seeds that Chris had been eating and sent them off to be analyzed.
And the results were shocking. The seeds were totally safe. There were no traces of the toxins everyone had suspected. This completely debunked the story everyone had accepted about Chris's death, and it opened up this whole new chapter in the mystery.
Krakauer was determined to find the truth, so he started digging deeper. He thought maybe there was a toxic mold growing on the seeds. But that didn't pan out either. The mystery just kept getting deeper, and the debate about Chris's death just raged on.
Then in 2013, a writer named Ronald Hamilton had this interesting theory. He'd been researching this horrible experiment from World War II at a Nazi concentration camp. They were deliberately feeding Jewish prisoners bread made with toxic grass pea seeds.
Yeah, and those prisoners developed a condition called latherism, which causes weakness and paralysis. The culprit was this neurotoxin called ODAP that's found in those grass pea seeds.
And what's scary is that the effects of ODAP are known to be especially bad for young men between 15 and 25 who are malnourished and physically active. Sounds a lot like Chris, doesn't it?
It's a striking parallel. Krakauer was intrigued, so he sent the wild potato seeds off for more tests, specifically to see if they had ODAP.
And what did they find?
They found ODAP, enough to potentially be lethal. Krakauer thought he'd finally solved the mystery and published his findings in The New Yorker. But the scientific community, they always want hard proof. They wanted more data, more research, peer-reviewed studies.
So Krakauer never wanted to back down. He used his own money to do more analysis. And here's where the story takes another crazy turn. The new tests show that the seeds didn't actually contain ODAP after all. Back to square one.
Unbelievable. It's like a scientific detective story. Every twist and turn leads to a dead end. But Krakauer was determined to get to the bottom of it. He kept searching through scientific papers for answers. And he found this study from 1960 that talked about a different toxic amino acid called L-canavanine. It had all the characteristics of the mystery substance in the seeds.
So could this be the answer? Krakauer had the seeds tested for L-canavanine. And this time the results were clear. The seeds had a ton of the toxin, way more than enough to cause the debilitating symptoms that Chris described in his journal: weakness, dizziness, the inability to stand or walk properly.
So after all those years of speculation and debate, it seemed like the mystery of Chris McCandless's death was finally solved. He had unknowingly poisoned himself by eating those wild potato seeds that contained L-canavanine. And it wasn't that he misidentified them, it was just that he didn't know.
Right. In the afterword to a later edition of Into the Wild, Krakauer writes, had McCandless's guidebook to edible plants warned that Hedysarum alpinum seeds contain a highly toxic secondary plant constituent, as L-canavanine is described in the scientific literature, he probably would have walked out of the wild in late August with no more difficulty than when he walked into it in April and would still be alive today.
That's so sad. Just one missing piece of information, one gap in his knowledge, and it cost him his life. Makes you think if he'd just known that one crucial fact, would his story have had a completely different ending?
But even with this scientific explanation, people are still arguing about Chris McCandless. He's still this controversial figure, a symbol of the allure and the dangers of going into the unknown.
Yeah, some people see him as a hero, this tragic figure who dared to live life on his own terms. a modern-day Thoreau looking for a simpler, more authentic way to live. But others think he was reckless, irresponsible, even selfish. Someone who risked his life for no reason and caused his loved ones so much pain.
And this debate is especially heated in Alaska. A lot of Alaskans are upset about the romanticized portrayal of Chris and all the unprepared adventurers who were inspired by his story. They see him as a symbol of disrespect for the wilderness, someone who underestimated the power of nature and paid the ultimate price.
It's interesting how Chris's story provokes such strong reactions, both good and bad. He's like a Rorschach test. He reveals as much about our own values and beliefs as he does about himself. Why do you think his story still resonates with people, even after all these years?
I think it speaks to this longing we all have, a desire to break free from the confines of modern life, to experience the raw beauty of nature, to test our limits, to find ourselves. But it also highlights the importance of balancing that desire with some common sense preparation and respect for the wild.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that even with the best intentions, our romantic visions can blind us to reality, to the consequences of our actions. But even though it ended tragically, Chris's story still fascinates us. It makes us think. It makes us question our own place in the world.
And that's what we'll talk about in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll explore the lasting legacy of Chris McCandless and the lessons we can learn from his life and death. We'll look at how his story has changed our understanding of wilderness ethics, the dangers of romanticizing nature, and our responsibility to protect ourselves and the environment. But before we move on, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what we've learned so far. What are your thoughts on what we've learned about Chris's death and the complicated reactions people still have to his story? We've really gone on this journey with Chris McCandless, haven't we? From the suburbs to the Alaskan wilderness, we've seen his idealism, his recklessness, and ultimately his tragic death.
Yeah, it's a story that sticks with you. It makes you think about where that line is between bravery and just plain foolishness. And it's amazing how Chris's story is like this mirror reflecting our own beliefs and values.
I remember when I first read Into the Wild. I was in my 20s, and I felt that pull towards Chris's desire for a simpler life, that rejection of the rat race. Did you feel that at all?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very human thing to want to find meaning beyond material success and societal expectations. And the wilderness, it becomes the symbol of that yearning, like a blank slate where you can rewrite your story.
But as we've seen, the wilderness isn't really a blank slate.
Right.
It's a powerful force with its own rules.
Yeah.
And it doesn't care about our romantic ideas.
Chris's story is a harsh reminder that nature demands respect, preparation, and a good dose of humility. We can't just wander into the wild unprepared and expect to survive on idealism alone.
It makes you think about responsibility too,
Yeah.
right? Not just to ourselves, but to the people we care about.
Yeah. Chris cutting off all contact with his family, disappearing like that, it caused them so much pain. And that's something a lot of people struggle with when they see him as this free spirit.
It's kind of strange how the place where Chris died has become this pilgrimage site for his fans.
Right.
People from all over the world travel to that bus on the Stampede Trail.
Oh.
They want to walk in his footsteps, experience that same allure of the wild.
It shows how powerful his story is, but it also raises some concerns about the dangers of romanticizing his journey, ignoring the real risks involved. Alaska is not a playground. It's a wilderness that deserves our respect.
And in 2020, they actually removed the bus from the wilderness.
Really?
Yeah, it's part of an exhibit now at the Museum of the North in Fairbanks. What do you think about that? Was it the right thing to do?
It was a tough call. Some people felt the bus should have stayed where it was as a reminder of Chris's story, a cautionary tale. But others thought it was the right decision because hikers kept risking their lives trying to get there.
It highlights how complicated Chris's legacy is. They're trying to preserve a piece of history, but also acknowledge the dangers of glorifying his choices.
Even after his death, Chris McCandless still makes us think. He forces us to confront our own ideas about risk responsibility and that human need to connect with the wild.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Chris McCandless's life and what he left behind, what are the biggest things that stand out to you? What are the key takeaways we should remember?
I think it reminds us that we don't need to go off into the wilderness to find ourselves. We can start that journey right here in our everyday lives, through our relationships, our work, the way we interact with the world around us.
It's about finding that balance between our desire for adventure and being prepared, being responsible, and respecting the power of nature. And it's about realizing that true happiness, like Chris learned in the end, is something we share with others.
His story may have ended in tragedy, but the questions he raised are still important. They make us examine our own values, our relationship with nature, and the choices we make as we try to live meaningful lives.
And that's the power of a story like Chris McCandless's. It's not just about one man's adventure in the wild. It's about all of us trying to understand who we are and where we fit in the world. So what does Chris's story tell you? What resonates with you the most? We encourage you to learn more about him. Read Into the Wild and come to your own conclusions. His journey may have ended tragically, but the conversation about it goes on.